Memphis, 1969. The king has just reclaimed his throne with the 68 comeback special, and the city buzzes with talk of his upcoming Vegas debut. But on a quiet stretch of road near Graceland, Elvis finds himself in a confrontation no stage could prepare him for. A plain, unmarked car pulls him over. Out steps a policeman with too much swagger and not enough authority. The charge? Speeding. But within minutes, it becomes clear this has nothing to do with traffic laws. The officer leans in, hinting at an easier solution. Money. A bribe. He assumes Elvis will cave, desperate to avoid scandal. Only he has no idea who he's dealing with. Because Elvis Presley isn't just a showman in a Cadillac. Beneath the rhinestones and the spotlight, he's a man obsessed with law enforcement, a collector of badges, someone who studied procedure late into the night while the world thought he was chasing fame. And so the tension snaps. The officer pushes with threats, and Elvis pushes back with calm precision. Not anger, not fear, but the quiet confidence of a man who knows the law better than the one wearing the badge. This is the Elvis the world rarely saw. Not just the idol on stage, but a citizen who could turn a midnight shakedown into a courtroom on the street and leave his accuser with nothing but silence. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The night air in Memphis carried the scent of wet asphalt and magnolia leaves. It was past midnight, and most of the city seemed to have given itself to silence, save for the occasional hum of a neon sign or the distant rumble of a freight train rolling along the Mississippi line. Elvis eased his Cadillac Eldorado along Union Avenue, the streetlights flickering across the hood in streaks of gold. He had just left American Sound Studio, still wearing the faint fatigue of a marathon recording session. Hours earlier, he had been pushing his voice through the raw edge of Suspicious Minds, testing phrasing until it sounded like something carved out of the marrow of his own life. Now the silence inside the car felt almost heavier than the music had. His hands rested lightly on the wheel, but his eyes carried the weight of exhaustion. The dashboard lights painted a soft glow across his face. He drove slowly, deliberately, letting the cool air from a half-cracked window wash over him. Memphis was home, and yet every familiar corner was threaded with ghosts. Childhood streets where he once walked with his mother. Dim diners where his early songs spun out of jukeboxes. Alleys where strangers whispered his name with awe or disdain. The city had memories woven into every shadow. As the Cadillac slid past the darkened storefronts, Elvis barely noticed the car that pulled in behind him. No siren, no flashing lights, just a nondescript vehicle trailing too close. He frowned, adjusted his mirror, but kept driving. After a block, the car flashed its headlights twice. Then it surged forward and swung abruptly in front of him, forcing him to brake. The street was empty, quiet enough to hear the ticking of his cooling engine. The other vehicle rolled to a halt just ahead. From it stepped a man in uniform, or at least a version of one. The shirt bore the insignia of the Memphis Police, but the fit was sloppy, the badge tilted as if it had been fastened in haste. The officer's posture radiated a peculiar brand of confidence. Shoulders thrown back, chest puffed out, like a man too eager to prove his authority. Elvis lowered his window. He kept his expression calm, though a knot of suspicion had already coiled in his stomach. "Evening, officer," he said, voice low, polite, carrying the faint rasp of fatigue. The man leaned down toward the window. His smile was thin, more smirk than courtesy. "Evening, Mr. Presley. You know you rolled through that last stop sign." Elvis blinked. He was certain he hadn't, but he chose not to argue. "Did I? My mistake, then." His tone was even, almost disarming. The officer tapped his fingers against the edge of the Cadillac door, studying him with a look that wasn't so much professional as predatory. These little mistakes can get messy, real messy, especially for a man like you. Elvis tilted his head, waiting. The officer's voice dropped, conspiratorial. Now, we don't have to make it official. No paperwork. No report in the morning paper. I'm sure you'd prefer to keep things quiet, right? He dragged out the word quiet, with deliberate weight. The meaning was clear. Elvis stayed silent for a beat, long enough to let the man feel the pause. Then, gently, he said, "I appreciate your concern, officer." The officer straightened, mistaking civility for compliance. He shifted closer, lowering his voice further. "It's simple. You and I can settle this, right here. A small contribution. A handshake between friends. Nobody ever needs to know." The night air seemed to thicken. Elvis's eyes narrowed, but his demeanor remained unchanged. Steady, calm, even warm. The temptation to respond with anger was there, curling just beneath the surface, but he pushed it down. He had learned long ago that anger only gave men like this more power. Instead, he leaned back against the leather seat, folded his hands loosely on the wheel, and regarded the man with something almost resembling curiosity. His voice, when it came, was soft enough to force the officer to lean in closer to hear it. "You sure that's how you want to handle this?" The officer blinked, thrown off by the question. For a moment, the swagger faltered, but then he recovered, plastering the smirk back on. "Why not? No harm done. You get to keep your clean record. I get to finish my shift happy. Everybody wins." Elvis let the silence hang again. He had a gift for it. On stage, he used pauses like weapons, drawing the crowd to the edge of their seats. Now he used it here, on a dark street, where the only audience was a man who had stepped out of line. "Funny thing about winning," Elvis finally said, his voice steady, low, rich with the timbre that had carried through recording studios and concert halls. "Sometimes you don't know you're losing until the game's already over." The officer shifted, unsettled. His smile tightened, his tone sharpened. "Don't play games with me, Presley. I'm giving you a way out. Don't make me take this further." But Elvis wasn't playing games. His calm was deliberate, his patience a kind of quiet pressure. He watched the man with a gaze that was neither hostile nor submissive, but something more dangerous, unshakably steady. The city around them remained silent, as if Memphis itself was holding its breath. The neon light from a liquor store sign flickered across the hood of the Cadillac, painting everything in pulses of red and white. Elvis did not raise his voice, did not break into a tirade. Instead, he began guiding the conversation. Subtle questions, polite remarks, a quiet insistence on clarity. Each word was chosen carefully, not to provoke, but to expose. He was steering, and though the officer hadn't realized it yet, the balance of power had already begun to shift. The night was no longer his. It belonged to Elvis. The officer's smirk grew harder, his voice dropping into a register meant to intimidate. "You think this is a joke, Presley? One call from me and the papers'll have a field day. King of rock and roll caught breaking the law. Headlines by sunrise. Imagine what that does to your Vegas run, huh? Promoters pull out. Fans get spooked. Whole career goes sideways before the curtain even rises." The words cut with precision, meant to sting. Elvis held his gaze, expression unreadable. He had heard every insult imaginable thrown at him since the first time he shook his hips on national television, but the officer's tactic wasn't ridicule. It was leverage, and leverage could be dangerous if allowed to stand. Elvis reached for his jacket pocket, moving slowly, deliberately. The officer's hand twitched toward his holster, a reflex born not of duty, but of nerves. Elvis noticed it, stored the detail away, and kept his movements calm. He pulled out his worn leather wallet, flipped it open, and thumbed past bills and receipts. The officer's eyes tracked the movement, anticipation sharp in his expression. He thought he was about to be paid. But instead of money, Elvis withdrew a small laminated card edged in gold. He held it between two fingers and let the faint glow from the streetlight illuminate the seal embossed at its center. Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. Special Agent. The officer blinked, momentarily unsure of what he was seeing. His smirk faltered, but pride forced him to scoff. "What's that supposed to be? Some kind of souvenir?" Elvis turned the card over with measured calm, the plastic reflecting the neon flicker from the liquor sign nearby. "This was given to me in Washington, not a souvenir." His tone was even, carrying no triumph, no mockery, just fact. Recognized by federal authority. The officer's jaw tightened. He leaned in closer, as if trying to see flaws in the lettering, some proof it was fake. But the detail was too fine, too official. His bravado cracked, just slightly. "Means nothin'," he muttered, voice harsher now, tinged with something uncomfortably close to panic. "You're just a singer with friends in high places. Doesn't change the fact you broke the law tonight." Elvis didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The power in his tone came not from volume but from weight, the unshakable calm of a man who knew where he stood. "You stopped me without a signal. No lights, no siren, no cause. Then you asked for money to make it disappear. That's not law. That's corruption." The officer shifted on his feet. His hand returned nervously to his belt, fingers brushing the holster. He was losing ground, and he knew it. To cover his unease, he tried bluster. "Careful with your words, Presley. Careful. You're treading on thin ice." Elvis leaned forward, resting his forearms casually on the wheel. The calm in his eyes was more unnerving than any anger could have been. "Thin ice?" His voice dropped lower, resonant, velvet threaded with steel. "Son, I grew up on thin ice. I know how to walk it better than most." The silence that followed pressed heavy between them. Even the faint hum of the Cadillac's idling engine seemed to recede. For the first time, it was the officer who broke eye contact, glancing down the empty street, searching for reassurance that wasn't there. Elvis took that moment and pressed it further, not by shouting, not by threats, but by precision. He asked questions, steady and direct, each one slicing deeper into the officer's shaky authority. "Did you record the stop in your log? Where's your cruiser number? Doesn't match your uniform. You got a warrant in your pocket to look through my car?" Each question landed like a hammer against thin glass. The officer's voice cracked under the pressure, each denial more frantic than the last. "Don't you try to turn this around on me. You think people will believe the word of some washed-up rock singer over an officer of the law?" Elvis allowed the insult to roll past him like dust on the wind. His calm only grew heavier. "You're shaken, officer. You feel that?" His tone was not cruel, but it cut all the same. "That's the sound of control slipping out of your hands." The officer snapped, his voice rising in a way that betrayed the fear under his bravado. "Don't tell me what I'm doing. I'm the law here, not you." But the words rang hollow. The cadence of command was gone, replaced with the shrill edge of a man cornered by his own overreach. Elvis didn't smile. He didn't need to. The silence he allowed after the outburst was more damning than any rebuttal. He sat back in his seat, the BNDD credential still balanced lightly between his fingers, catching the neon glow as if it were a mirror reflecting back the truth neither of them could escape. And in that silence, the shift was complete. The hunter had become the prey. The night in Memphis seemed to tighten around them, the air itself holding witness to a battle fought not with fists or bullets, but with steadiness, patience, and the quiet strength of a man who had learned that sometimes the most devastating weapon of all was calm. The standoff might have continued in that charged silence, if not for the sudden sweep of headlights bending around the corner. Another car approached from the far end of the block, its tires humming softly against the pavement. The officer stiffened, his jaw tightening, a flicker of unease breaking across his face. The vehicle slowed as it neared, then rolled to a stop a few yards away. Inside, a man leaned forward, peering through the windshield. The outline of a notepad on the dashboard and the flash of a camera bag told the story before introductions were made. It wasn't just another driver passing through. It was a journalist. The officer muttered something under his breath, sharp and vulgar, barely audible. He straightened his uniform shirt and tried to compose himself, but the sweat on his brow betrayed him. The reporter, a wiry man with a fedora tilted back on his head, stepped out into the cool Memphis night. He squinted under the neon glow, and recognition spread quickly across his features. "Mr. Presley?" His tone carried the same surprise any stranger might have when stumbling into a living legend on an empty street after midnight. Elvis inclined his head politely, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Evening, sir." The reporter's eyes darted between the Cadillac and the uneasy officer standing beside it. The posture of both men told its own story. One steady as a stone, the other taut with nervous energy. He reached instinctively for the notebook in his breast pocket. That simple motion shifted the air. The officer, suddenly aware that his actions were no longer shielded by solitude, forced a laugh. It came out brittle, far too rehearsed. "Just a friendly chat, that's all. Mr. Presley here made a little traffic slip, but we were working it out. Nothing worth writing about, friend." His tone was too quick, too bright, the sort of false cheer a guilty man uses when he knows the walls are closing in. Elvis didn't contradict him outright. Instead, he turned slightly toward the reporter, his voice smooth, deliberate. "This gentleman stopped me without lights or siren. Then he suggested the matter could be resolved without a citation." He let the words settle in the air like dust motes. No accusation, just fact, stated plainly. The officer's eyes flashed with anger. "That's not what I said," he snapped. But his voice cracked on the last syllable, betraying the tremor beneath the words. The reporter, sensing the tremor in the exchange, opened his notebook and began to scribble, the sound of pen against paper sharp in the stillness. That scratching noise, faint, repetitive, was like a metronome of truth, counting down the seconds until the facade collapsed. Elvis remained composed, his tone never rising. "You'll have your version," he said softly, turning to the officer, "and I'll have mine. And this man here will decide what the people read." The words weren't threatening. They carried no venom. But they struck deeper than any outburst could. For the first time, the officer seemed to shrink inside his uniform, the badge on his chest no longer gleaming with authority, but sagging like a weight he couldn't carry. The journalist adjusted his hat, eyes narrowing with curiosity. He wasn't looking at Elvis the performer now, not the glittering star of stages in Vegas, or the idol plastered on record covers. What he saw was a man who understood power beyond the microphone, a man who carried himself with the confidence of someone unwilling to be bullied by titles or cheap threats. The officer attempted a different tactic, his voice suddenly syrupy, almost pleading. "Mr. Presley, let's not make a scene. You know how rumors spread in this town. I was just trying to keep things easy for you. Maybe I came on a little strong. That's all. Elvis studied him, the way one might regard a card player bluffing on a weak hand. He said nothing, simply let the silence stretch until the officer shifted again, his hands restless at his sides. The reporter broke the quiet, his pen still scratching. "Mr. Presley, are you saying this officer asked you for a bribe?" Elvis tilted his head, choosing his words with care. "I'm saying he gave me an offer I had no interest in taking." His voice was steady, his southern drawl quiet but resonant. The officer flinched, as though every syllable were a nail hammered into the coffin of his authority. For the first time that night, the dynamic was no longer two men locked in private battle. There was now an audience, however small, and with it came accountability. The officer's every movement, every stammer, every nervous glance was being preserved in ink. Elvis didn't press further. He didn't need to. The truth was already being documented, line by line. He simply sat in his Cadillac, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other holding the BNDD credential on his lap, a quiet reminder of his connections and his conviction. The reporter, notebook filling with quick strokes, looked at him with something close to admiration. Not the shallow admiration of a fan dazzled by fame, but the respect reserved for someone who refused to bend when bending would have been easier. The officer, by contrast, looked smaller with each passing second. His earlier swagger had drained away, leaving only a man exposed by the very arrogance that had emboldened him. The night stretched on, heavy with consequence. And though no one had spoken it aloud, the balance had shifted irrevocably. The officer had lost the shadows to hide in. The air on that lonely Memphis street had shifted. What began as a simple stop had swollen into a tableau. Elvis behind the wheel of his Cadillac, a rattled officer standing by the door, and a reporter quietly taking notes under the glow of a flickering street lamp. The officer tried to maintain his posture, but his body betrayed him. His hand hovered too long near his holster. His boots shifted restlessly against the pavement. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cool night. Elvis studied him with steady patience. He wasn't gloating, wasn't mocking. His face carried the same quiet focus he might have worn in a recording booth, working a lyric until it fit like a blade in its sheath. "You know," Elvis said softly, his drawl stretched out, "there's a reason states write things down in books. Laws, procedures. Keeps men honest. Keeps folks safe." The officer bristled, forcing a chuckle that landed awkwardly. "Don't lecture me, Presley. I've been wearing this badge longer than you've been singing love songs." But the tremor in his voice undercut the bravado. Elvis tilted his head slightly, like a teacher guiding a stubborn student. His voice remained calm, but the edge of precision was unmistakable. "You pulled me over without your lights, without your siren. You didn't state a charge. You suggested cash instead of a citation. That ain't procedure. That ain't law." The officer's lips tightened. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to form an answer that wouldn't sound like an admission. The reporter's pen scratched rhythmically in his notebook. That small sound, scratch, scratch, pause, scratch, gnawed at the officer's nerves more than any words Elvis might deliver. Each stroke felt like another piece of evidence sliding into place. Elvis leaned back in his seat, one hand resting lightly on the wheel, the other still holding the BNDD credential across his lap. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, yet the weight of the moment pressed hard on the officer. "Do you have a log of this stop?" Elvis asked suddenly. His voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the still night. The officer blinked. "What?" "A log," Elvis repeated, slower this time. Regulations require you to record every stop, time, location, reason. Did you mark it down? The officer swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. I was about to. Before or after you asked for money? Elvis's voice carried no malice. Just fact. The officer's face flushed red. He shifted from foot to foot, tugged at the strap of his holster. His hand twitched as though it wanted to point, to threaten, to claw back control, but there was no way to grab hold of it. Elvis pressed again, unyielding. You got a warrant on you? Any right to look through this car? The silence was answer enough. The reporter's pen moved faster. The officer tried to force laughter, but it came out brittle. You think you're some kind of lawyer now? No, Elvis replied evenly. I just know the rules that protect men like me, and protect men like you, if you follow 'em. His tone sharpened on the last words, like a chord struck hard on a guitar. The officer muttered something under his breath, eyes darting away. For the first time, he looked less like a man of authority, and more like a figure caught trespassing on ground he had no right to stand on. The soundscape around them deepened the tension. A dog barked faintly in the distance. The Cadillac's engine ticked as it cooled. The reporter's pen clicked once, then resumed its scratching. And in the middle of it all was Elvis's voice, calm, resonant, undeniable. Answer me this, Elvis said after a pause. When you stopped me, was it for the law or for yourself? The officer exhaled sharply, more hiss than breath. His hands clenched at his sides. The reporter raised his head briefly, eyes narrowing as he jotted down the question verbatim. The officer tried again to retreat behind his mask of authority. You don't get to question me, Presley. I'm the officer here. But his words carried no weight anymore. He sounded less like a figure of law and more like a man trying to convince himself. Elvis didn't respond immediately. He let the silence expand, knowing silence was sometimes louder than words. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady as stone. Law ain't about uniforms. It's about trust. Break that, and the uniform's just cloth. The line landed like a verdict. The officer's jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his cheeks quivered. His eyes flicked toward the reporter's notebook, then back to Elvis. He understood too well what was happening. His authority wasn't simply being challenged. It was unraveling, thread by thread, under the light of scrutiny. The reporter, now fully aware of the magnitude of the scene, pulled a camera from his bag. The click of the shutter echoed in the empty street, sharp and final. Each flash burned the officer's face into record. Not as a guardian of law, but as a man cornered by his own misdeeds. The officer flinched at the sound, his hand tightening near his holster again. But he didn't draw. He couldn't. The presence of the notebook, the camera, and Elvis's steady voice had built a wall around him. And Elvis sat there, silent once more, watching as the man unraveled. Not as a rock star, not as an entertainer, but as a citizen who understood that sometimes the greatest power lay in knowing the rules better than the man who claimed to enforce them. The thin line had been drawn, and the officer was teetering on the wrong side of it. For a moment, the night seemed suspended, as if the street itself was listening. The officer stood rigid, his jaw set, but his hands restless. The reporter's pen kept moving in sharp strokes, the sound almost accusatory. Elvis remained calm behind the wheel, but his mind turned inward, reaching back through the years. This wasn't the first time he had faced men in uniform who believed a badge made them untouchable. He'd seen it long ago, long before fame built its fortress around him. Memory flooded in. It was 1956. a year after his first records caught fire across America. The boy from Tupelo was suddenly on stages he had never dared to imagine, the world around him moving too fast to catch his breath. Yet beneath the noise of adoration, he had always been drawn to something quieter, the discipline of lawmen, the rituals of authority, the codes written in black and white. He remembered stopping by small-town sheriff's offices on tour, asking questions others might have found odd. What procedures kept order? How did they decide when to use force, and when restraint? Most laughed at him, the famous singer with a childlike fascination for badges. But he listened carefully, storing every detail as though each answer was another lyric in a song only he understood. Later, after returning from his army service in Germany, the curiosity only deepened. Nights on the road were filled with law books he carried in his suitcase, their spines worn from constant handling. He was no scholar, but he read with hunger, underlining statutes, memorizing passages, letting the knowledge settle into him. And then there was Washington, 1970. He had walked the corridors of power, shaking hands with men who governed not just cities, but the nation itself. He remembered the moment President Nixon handed him a BNDD badge, the feel of it, cool metal pressed into his palm. To others it might have seemed a trinket, a novelty. But to Elvis, it was recognition of the seriousness he had always carried about law and order. It was proof that he wasn't just a figure in sequins. He was trusted, in his way, by the highest office in the land. The memory dissolved, and the street returned. Elvis reached again into his wallet, his movements slow, deliberate. Not for money, not for show, but for a folded slip of paper, its edges softened by time. He held it between two fingers, extending it toward the flickering light so both the officer and the reporter could see. It was a letter, short, official, typed on Washington stationery. At the bottom, a neat signature from a high-ranking official in the Bureau of Narcotics, thanking Elvis Presley for his support in spreading awareness of the dangers of illicit drugs. The officer's eyes darted toward it, confusion mixing with dread. "This," Elvis said, his voice low, measured, "came straight from Washington. Recognition for standing beside men who enforce the law the right way, who protect, not exploit. You see the difference?" The officer's lips moved, but no words came out. His earlier swagger had vanished, replaced by a haunted look, as though the badge on his chest had grown heavier by the second. Elvis's gaze held firm, but his tone never shifted into cruelty. He wasn't taunting. He wasn't celebrating victory. He was simply laying the truth in front of the man, letting it burn on its own. "You wear that uniform," Elvis continued softly, "but when you ask for money in the dark, you're not protecting anyone. You're betraying the very thing you swore to uphold. You're not just breaking the law, you're breaking trust. And once that's gone, what's left of your badge?" The words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were spoken without malice. They came like a verdict that needed no jury. The reporter's pen scratched furiously. He didn't even look up, so focused was he on capturing every syllable. But Elvis noticed something shift in his posture. The journalist wasn't just documenting a scandal anymore. He was witnessing a man of immense cultural power speaking with the authority of a citizen who understood the stakes of integrity. The officer finally found his voice, but it trembled. "You think just 'cause you've got friends in Washington, you can tell me what's right? You're just an entertainer." Elvis shook his head slowly. "No, sir. I'm a man who reads, who listens, who learns. Fame don't change that. You think this badge," he lifted the BNDD credentials slightly, "was given as a toy? They don't hand these out for pretty songs. They gave it because they knew I meant it." The officer's breathing grew ragged. His eyes darted from Elvis to the reporter, to the letter, then back again, like a cornered animal seeking escape. But there was none. Elvis's next words dropped like a hammer. "Right now, you're not wearing a badge. You're wearing a costume." The silence that followed was devastating. Even the reporter paused his pen for a heartbeat, as if to let the sentence breathe before etching it into permanence. The officer swallowed hard. His shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. The confidence that had carried him when he first stepped out of his car was gone, leaving behind only the image of a man stripped bare by the very authority he had abused. Elvis didn't gloat. He didn't raise his chin in triumph. Instead, his face softened into something like sorrow. Because, in his eyes, this wasn't victory, it was tragedy. A man had traded honor for greed, and now the cost of that trade was plain for all to see. The street lamp buzzed overhead. The air was heavy with the weight of memory, authority, and consequence. Elvis sat steady, his past stretched out before him like a shield, unshakable, undeniable. And the officer, confronted with that shield, had nowhere left to hide. The silence between them stretched long enough for the street to feel colder, as though the city itself was waiting for what would come next. The officer's chest rose and fell in uneven rhythms, his breathing heavy with agitation. His eyes no longer held dominance. They flickered instead with calculation, searching for some escape route that wouldn't leave him disgraced in front of the man he had tried to corner. The reporter kept writing. The scratching of his pen had become a second pulse in the scene. Steady, insistent, unrelenting. Each mark on the page stripped away another layer of the officer's control. He knew it too. Every second that passed without him reclaiming the upper hand was a second that made him look weaker, guiltier, smaller. Finally, he tried a new tactic. His tone shifted. Not bluster now, but a counterfeit version of sincerity. "Mr. Presley," he began, voice pitched low, as though speaking in confidence, "we don't need to ruin each other's lives tonight. You got your connections, I got mine. I could make things easy for you. Easier than you think." Elvis raised an eyebrow. "Easy how?" The officer leaned closer, his words quick and hushed, as though the reporter standing just a few feet away couldn't possibly overhear. "I know people, local men who keep things running smooth. They could overlook certain habits. Close an eye when it matters, as long as we understand each other." It was bribery repackaged, not cash this time, but favors, protection, unspoken promises drawn from the underbelly of Memphis politics. A darker offer than the first. Elvis let the man finish. Then he inhaled slowly, his gaze steady, his voice quiet enough to force the officer to listen carefully. "What exactly is it you think I need covered up?" The question hit like a trap, snapping shut. The officer's pupils widened. He hadn't expected it. He tried to recover. "I didn't mean nothing by it. Just thought maybe a man in your position might want friends in the right places." Elvis's expression didn't change, but he pressed further, the same way he might coax a fragile note out of a guitar string. Gentle, deliberate, but relentless. "And these friends, what do they do for you? Do they expect a cut? Do they know you're out here stopping drivers without cause?" The officer swallowed hard. His throat made an audible click. "You asked if I had something to hide," Elvis continued, "but seems to me you're the one hiding." The reporter's pen froze in mid-stroke. The stillness made the officer crack a little more. He blurted out words he hadn't planned. "You don't know this city, Presley." You think it's just music and neon lights. But there are men in Memphis who decide what gets seen, what disappears. They decide who walks free and who gets buried in paperwork. And they're listening. Elvis's voice remained level, though the steel in it sharpened. Then you just said more than you should have. The officer flinched. He realized too late he had spoken too freely. His desperate attempt to intimidate had instead confirmed the suspicion that he was tangled in something far larger than a late-night stop. Elvis leaned back, crossing one arm over the wheel, his tone almost conversational, though each question carried the weight of cross-examination. So tell me, when you flashed that badge, was it the city behind you? Or those men you just named without naming? The officer shook his head quickly, trying to reel himself back. I didn't name anyone. You didn't have to. The reporter started writing again, faster than before, as if chasing down every word before it could vanish. The officer's composure unraveled with every passing second. His palms opened and closed, restless. His voice rose slightly, betraying the edge of panic he couldn't contain. You're twisting this! You're making it sound worse than it is. Elvis didn't blink. I ain't twisting a thing. I'm asking questions, and you're answering them louder than you realize. The tension in the street was thick enough to feel in the lungs. Even the shadows seemed to press closer. Elvis paused, allowing the silence to do its work. Then he spoke again, quieter, cutting through the air like a blade. You wanted me to choose between fear and silence. But I've already made my choice. And you, officer, you're the one standing at the fork now. Either you tell the truth, or you let that pen, he nodded toward the reporter, write it for you. The officer glanced at the notebook, then back at Elvis, then at the dark street around them. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He was caught in his own web, and the threads were tightening. What had begun as a stop for supposed traffic violation had turned into something more dangerous. A confession unraveling in slow motion, coaxed out not by force, but by calm, relentless questions. And Elvis, still sitting in the driver's seat, looked less like a singer under scrutiny, and more like a detective conducting an interrogation. The officer's voice cracked finally, thin with desperation. You don't understand what you're doing, Presley. You think this is just between us? It's bigger than that. Bigger than me. Elvis didn't flinch. He let the words hang, then answered with quiet gravity. Everything's bigger than one man. But it always comes down to one choice. Yours. The street fell still again. The officer's face glistened with sweat, his posture shrinking under the invisible weight pressing on him. The reporter clicked his pen closed, as though even he could feel the scene tipping toward a moment that could no longer be reversed. And in that charged stillness, the choice lay bare. The officer's words still lingered in the air. Half threat, half plea. When the night shifted again, a pair of headlights crept along the street, slowing as they neared the Cadillac. Then another set of lights, and another. Cars began edging to the curb, their drivers craning their necks as they realized who sat behind the wheel of the sleek Eldorado. It didn't take long for whispers to spread. That's Elvis. Elvis Presley. The name rippled through the small cluster of onlookers like a spark through dry grass. A couple stepped out of their vehicle, hushed voices carrying disbelief. Another man leaned against his truck, folding his arms, waiting to see what drama was unfolding. The officer's eyes darted around, panic creeping into his features. This was the opposite of what he had wanted. A quiet shakedown had become a scene, a gathering audience. Authority thrived in shadows, in solitude. But here, under the yellow wash of streetlights, and the curious stares of strangers, it was dissolving fast. Elvis stayed composed. He didn't acknowledge the small crowd forming, though he could feel their eyes fixed on him. Instead, he let their presence work silently in his favor. The officer, who had relied on intimidation, now found himself exposed in the harshest way, not by violence or shouting, but by visibility. The reporter, sensing the escalation, discreetly stepped back toward his car and pulled open the door. The faint click of the rotary dial carried across the street. He was making a call. The officer stiffened, his hand twitching again near his belt. But the reporter kept his voice calm, professional, identifying himself, giving the location, requesting verification about an officer who had stopped Elvis Presley under suspicious circumstances. The words were like a blade slipped under the officer's armor. His face flushed with rage, then drained of color just as quickly. He snapped, his voice rising too high. "You got no right calling anyone. This is my stop, my jurisdiction." Elvis turned his gaze toward him, steady, unshaken. "If it's your stop," he said softly, "then you won't mind someone checking the record." The murmurs from the gathering crowd grew louder. People shifted uneasily, some whispering about corruption, others about the king of rock and roll being hassled in his own city. Every voice chipped away at the officer's crumbling facade. He tried to regain control, stepping closer to the Cadillac, lowering his voice again. "You don't understand what you're stirring up here, Presley. These folks don't matter. What matters is what I put in my report. That's what lasts." But Elvis leaned forward slightly, his words clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. Reports can be altered. Memories can't. And every one of these people's going to remember what they saw tonight. The officer flinched as though struck. His eyes darted across the faces, staring back at him from the sidewalk, each expression quietly judging, each pair of eyes stripping away the power he had once wielded so carelessly. Elvis didn't press with anger. Instead, he used presence. His calm was louder than shouting, his steady composure more damning than any accusation. Even without sequins or spotlight, he radiated the same gravity he carried on stage, the kind that pulled audiences into silence before the first note. The officer muttered again, almost to himself, "You don't know who you're dealing with." But the line fell flat, because by then, it wasn't just Elvis he was facing. It was the reporter, notebook and camera at the ready. It was the crowd, witnesses multiplying by the minute. And it was the truth, pressing in from all sides, impossible to smother. Elvis asked one more question, quiet but cutting. "Tell me, when this goes public, what'll those men you spoke of do? Protect you? Or leave you out here alone?" The officer had no answer. His mouth opened, then closed again, the silence more telling than any denial. The reporter returned from his car, slipping the notebook back into his pocket. He gave Elvis a slight nod, then leveled his gaze at the officer. "Call's been made. If you're legitimate, your name's about to be cleared. If not..." He let the implication hang in the humid night air. The officer's face tightened, veins standing out in his neck. He looked as if he might lash out, might grab at authority one last time through force. But the presence of the growing audience pinned him in place. To act rashly now would only seal his downfall faster. Elvis remained motionless behind the wheel, his voice finally breaking the silence with measured calm. "You wanted this quiet. Instead, you got a stage. And the difference is, you don't know how to stand on it." The crowd stirred. Some exchanged glances. Others whispered about the courage it took for a man, even a famous one, to speak so plainly to authority. The officer's hands curled into fists, then slowly loosened. His breathing was ragged, his stance no longer proud but defensive, cornered. And though no verdict had yet been delivered, the truth was already closing in, drawing tighter with every new pair of eyes that bore witness. The trap had been sprung. The tension snapped when fresh headlights turned the corner, brighter, sharper, steady in their rhythm. A patrol car, this time official, rolled up with the red and blue bar across its roof, reflecting off shop windows. The sound of tires crunching gravel cut through the murmurs of the crowd. The fake officer froze. His stance stiffened as the car slowed beside the scene. Two uniformed policemen stepped out, younger than him, their movements brisk, practiced. They exchanged quick looks at the cluster of onlookers, then at Elvis, instantly recognizing him in the driver's seat. Their eyes narrowed at the man in front of the Cadillac, their supposed colleague, who suddenly looked less like an officer of law and more like a thief caught mid-act. "Evenin'," one of them said cautiously. His voice carried the formality of someone who knew the night could pivot in several directions. "What's happening here?" Elvis didn't rush. He opened his wallet once more, held out the BNDD credential, and placed the folded Washington letter beside it on the dashboard. "This man stopped me without lights or cause," he said evenly, then suggested I could avoid a charge with cash. When I declined, he tried another way. He didn't raise his tone, didn't dramatize. He let the facts stand, stripped of embellishment. The crowd hushed. The two younger officers glanced at each other, tension rippling between them. One of them stepped closer to the supposed officer. "Badge number?" he asked sharply. The man shifted his weight, swallowed hard. "I don't need to answer that in front of—" "Yes, you do," the younger cop interrupted, his voice cutting through the night with authority that felt clean, practiced, official. "Protocol says you identify yourself when requested. Badge number." The crowd stirred again, whispers rolling like waves. The imposter's mouth tightened. He mumbled a number too quickly, too slurred to be real. The second officer pulled a small pad from his pocket, jotted it down, and frowned. "That number doesn't exist in the roster," he said flatly. It was as if the ground had dropped beneath him. The man sputtered, words tangling into excuses. It's a temporary assignment. Special—" The reporter snapped his notebook shut with a decisive sound. "That's enough," he said. "I've got the entire exchange recorded in shorthand. I heard him ask for money. I heard him offer favors. And I've got a picture of the credentials Elvis just showed." He tapped his camera bag with finality. The imposter spun toward him, rage flashing. "You print that, and you'll regret it?" "Careful," Elvis interrupted, his voice calm, but carrying like thunder rolling low across the horizon. "Threatening a member of the press only digs you deeper." The crowd's murmur grew louder, people nodding, some muttering about corruption, others clucking their tongues in disapproval. What had been private was now irreversibly public. The real officers stepped closer, one placing a firm hand on the imposter's arm. "That's enough, sir. You're coming with us until this gets cleared." Panic flared in the man's eyes. He pulled back, voice cracking. "You can't do this. I was protecting the city. You don't understand who you're crossing." But even his colleagues no longer looked at him as one of their own. One officer's jaw was tight with anger, the other's eyes cold with disgust. "You've embarrassed the badge," one of them said quietly, almost under his breath but loud enough for the bystanders to hear. Desperation seized the imposter. He pointed a trembling finger at Elvis. "He tried to bribe me. He's the one at fault." Gasps rippled through the crowd, but before doubt could settle, the reporter raised his hand. His voice was steady, deliberate. "That's a lie. I was here from the beginning. I heard every word. And if you want, I can have this in tomorrow's paper. Front page. The impostor faltered, shoulders slumping, his face pale as chalk. He looked around the circle of witnesses, the officers glaring at him, the reporter armed with notes and camera, the crowd murmuring judgment, and at the center of it all, Elvis, steady as stone, his calm more crushing than any shout. The truth had spilled beyond his control. Every attempt to twist, to bluff, to claw back authority had collapsed under the weight of witnesses and evidence. The younger officer pulled out handcuffs, the metallic clink echoing down the street. The impostor tried one last protest, but the sound of the crowd drowned him out. Their whispers had become a chorus, a quiet verdict, delivered not in court, but in the court of public memory. Elvis didn't move. He watched silently as the man was restrained, his eyes steady, expression unreadable. There was no triumph in his face, no satisfaction. Only a sober awareness that justice wasn't loud. It was quiet, deliberate, final. The impostor's voice cracked one last time as he was led toward the patrol car. "You don't know what you've done, Presley. You don't know who'll come after you." But the words rang hollow. No one believed him anymore. The sound of the car door slamming shut swallowed the threat whole. The crowd lingered, staring at Elvis with something deeper than admiration. It wasn't the dazzled look of fans at a concert. It was respect, born from witnessing a man defend himself with nothing more than composure, knowledge, and unshakable dignity. The reporter stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You didn't need a stage to show strength tonight. You made the street your courtroom." Elvis glanced at him, a faint shadow of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Courtrooms got judges. Out here, all we got is truth, and truth don't need a robe." The reporter nodded slowly, his pen poised once more. The night was quieter now. The impostor gone, the crowd still buzzing, the real officers standing sentinel. But something had shifted irreversibly. The lie had been broken open, and the truth was walking free in the open air of Memphis. The patrol car door shut with a heavy thud, the sound reverberating down the quiet Memphis block. The impostor sat inside, wrists bound, his head lowered. The younger officers exchanged a curt nod before sliding into their own vehicle. Within moments, the car pulled away, its red taillights shrinking into the distance until only the glow of street lamps remained. The crowd lingered. They had expected fireworks, perhaps anger or some grand pronouncement from Elvis Presley, the king who could make arenas quake with a single note. But what they saw instead was a man leaning back in his Cadillac, silent, his expression marked not by triumph, but by something more solemn. A hush fell over the gathering. It wasn't the hush of curiosity now, but of respect. These people, shop clerks, mechanics, families on their way home, had become witnesses to more than a scandal. They had seen authority challenged without fists, fame wielded without arrogance, and dignity preserved without theatrics. Elvis finally opened his door and stepped out. The night air was cooler now, brushing across his face. He stood tall but unassuming, his silhouette framed by the soft halo of the street lamp. For a moment, he didn't address anyone. He simply looked at the spot where the impostor had stood. The badge on his chest, false authority clung to his shoulders, and shook his head slightly, as though mourning something lost. The reporter approached, notebook tucked under his arm, his camera strap slung across his shoulder. "Mr. Presley," he said quietly, "would you care to give a statement?" Elvis met his gaze, and for a long pause, it seemed he might decline altogether. Then, in a voice just loud enough for the crowd to hear, he spoke. Law ain't supposed to be about fear, or threats, or what a man can get away with. It's about trust. Folks believe in it, or they don't. And if that trust breaks, there ain't a badge or a uniform in the world that can fix it. The words carried across the street in a tone that was neither rehearsed nor theatrical. They were simple, steady, spoken like a truth distilled through years of watching, listening, and learning. The reporter scribbled furiously, but the crowd didn't move. They seemed to want the silence that followed just as much as the words themselves, letting them sink in, letting them linger. One of the onlookers, an older man with grease on his hands from a mechanic's shift, removed his cap and nodded slowly. Another woman whispered to her child, pointing at Elvis not with the giddy awe of a fan, but with the reverence reserved for someone who had stood for something larger than himself. Elvis didn't linger on their reactions. He wasn't interested in applause. Instead, he closed his wallet, slid the BNDD credential back inside, and tucked the Washington letter carefully into its fold. He moved with deliberate calm, as though sealing away not just documents, but the reminder of what they represented. Responsibility, not spectacle. The reporter hesitated. "Do you want me to print this?" he asked softly. Elvis looked at him, eyes steady. "Print the truth. That's all that matters. People can make their own judgment." It wasn't a command, nor a plea. It was a simple principle, one that carried more weight than a dozen angry denials ever could. The younger officers approached then, standing at respectful distance. One of them, the one who had demanded the badge number, cleared his throat. "Mr. Presley, I just want to say, what you did tonight took courage. Some men would have paid and walked away." Elvis studied him, then offered a faint smile. "Courage is just patience that doesn't quit. And sometimes patience is louder than shoutin'." The officer nodded, his respect plain, before stepping back to rejoin his partner. The crowd, sensing the night's conclusion, began to disperse. Cars pulled away slowly, conversations hushed but animated, every person carrying a piece of what they had seen. They hadn't just witnessed Elvis Presley, star of stages and screens. They had seen the man who refused to bend, who met corruption with calm, who made dignity feel more powerful than rage. As the last murmurs faded, Elvis turned back toward his Cadillac. He ran a hand across the polished edge of the driver's door, as though grounding himself once more in the ordinary. He slid inside, the leather creaking softly beneath him. For a moment, he sat in silence, the faint hum of the city pressing at the edges of the night. He thought of his mother, of his father, of the boy from Tupelo who had once stared wide-eyed at men in uniform, dreaming of the honor they carried. He thought of how that honor had been twisted tonight, then reclaimed not with fists or force, but with restraint. The engine rumbled to life. He rested both hands on the wheel, his face calm, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Behind him, the street quieted once more, the echoes of confrontation fading into memory. No headlines, no curtain calls, no roar of applause. Just the dignity of a man who had stood his ground, defended trust, and left without needing to proclaim victory. Because real victory, Elvis knew, wasn't in shouting the loudest. It was in walking away with your integrity intact. And as the Cadillac eased into the Memphis night, the city seemed to exhale, carrying his words into the shadows. Trust is everything. Lose that, and nothing else holds.